Welcome to another broadcast from mindyourhealthcast.com. As you are probably aware by now, we do these weekly chats. We don't do it fireside. I don't have a fireplace available here. But we will continue to endeavor to persevere to bring you all kinds of information, that which you might like, that which you may not like, that which you may agree with, and that which you may not agree with, which is perfectly okay. My job is to provoke you and to challenge you and get you thinking, well, maybe I might want to do a rethink about what I've thought, believed, or been told was true. There are, unfortunately, many pieces of information that have been put out to the public that are not necessarily totally accurate. I wouldn't want to say that they're blatant lies, but some are pretty close to it. But they are definitely misinformation, and sometimes with good intent. Sometimes the people passing it on rely on the people they received it from, and they pass it to you. And I have to admit that in my younger years, when I was first getting into the health field, I was dependent on what someone else was handing me. But as time went on and I began to investigate, I began to realize that, well, it's maybe not quite like that. And then when I started to study historically what's gone on in time past with medicine, I began to realize that there was a much bigger picture than what I had been presented with. Now, I, like most people, grew up with the introduction of modern medicine, especially post-World War II, that the medical field would eventually be able to perform miracles. And I'm not saying that in some rare cases, especially when it comes to injury repair from terrible accidents or defects from birth that are really bad, that in many cases, I would say the surgical wing of medicine has done extremely well. And I'm sure that, in fact, I know that if we're in a terrible accident, I'd want the best emergency room doctor that I could find. So I'm not opposed to medicine in general. I think that, unfortunately, one portion of medicine was taken over by greater interest, financial, being the pharmaceutical industry, and that unfortunately the modern physician, on the average, is totally influenced by and controlled by the pharmaceutical industry for their profit. We don't want to get into that today in any detail. We've talked about it before, and probably in the future we'll talk about it somewhat again. I do want you to continue to dig on your own and research on your own. And as you know, when you get on the internet, unfortunately, many things are contradictory. You find one person who says you must always do something, and you find another person who says you must never do it, and everything in between. So at some point, you have to weigh the evidence, you have to weigh the sources, and the preponderance of evidence, as they do in a civil court. To decide a case, you're supposed to determine who produces the preponderance of evidence in favor. And in many cases, it may be that neither side is right. There may be some other alternative or combination thereof that one might need to look at. So it's not easy, and I don't propose that it's that simple. The more I've studied the history of medicine, and I think I've mentioned before, I've gone back over the last 200 years of medicine, the last 200 years of health and sickness and food supply and so forth, and it's not been necessarily a pretty picture, as seems to be the case in so many cases. What happens is that the money interests run the show, bottom line. And the bigger the money, the more influence they have, and the more control they have to keep anyone from interfering with what they're doing. And that's, of course, what happened to the health field. It was what I mentioned before about Benjamin Rush, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, who was concerned that the medical field might become a monopoly. And of course, he had some encounters with politically influenced, medical influenced individuals. In other words, the coming together of politics and medicine. And he realized that it was very difficult to deal with something that was not right when both politics and medicine were involved. And he made that warning, and of course we have not heeded that, and so here we are, a nation that's sicker than ever. And I keep posing the question, if modern medicine as it is presented is solving the problem and making us healthier, then why do we have such an increase in chronic illnesses? If in fact that is true, we would be a healthier nation. We would have a lower bill. Every year it goes up. When it gets up into the trillions, we can't afford it. And so now, with some of the new proposals out there, you're going to be shocked, if you haven't been already, that you're going to find that they're going to say, we can't afford it, therefore you can't be treated. And of course they're going to pick those people which their panel decides is not cost effective. They're not producing, they're on the retired or elderly side. No, we can't afford to do the treatment, so we'll just have to let nature take its course. That's when they believe in natural things, is when they can pull out the money and let it go. So anyhow, that's not our subject today. Our real subject I came up with is what bugs us. And when I say that, it's kind of being funny about the term bug, because most people refer to these teeny little things that you can't see, but seem to be involved in some kind of problem with their health, that more often are referred to as germs. We're going to talk about that a little bit and what the real answer is. And I can tell you right off at the beginning, the real answer is that an extremely healthy person does not have to worry very much about germs, like someone whose system is very weak and compromised and malnourished. And that makes a tremendous difference. So we need to talk a little bit, first of all, about food, because it seems to really start there. And when I'm talking about food, now we've talked a bit about the soil and about healthy food versus unhealthy food, etc., etc. And if you haven't caught those broadcasts, you might want to go back and look at them. But today, of course, we're not talking about food in terms of the details, but it all starts with our food. You know, once we're born, in order to keep this system of ours moving and growing and being able to function properly, requires the intake of something called food. Now, we get food where? Well, we get it from two sources. Well, actually one source, but there's an intermediary step in one of those forces or sources. So, basically, plants grow from the soil. And when a plant grows, if it's in healthy soil, and if it's not poisoned by environmental or exterior sources, or even from the soil, then it grows and absorbs from the soil various nutrients, which then in turn, if we take those plants and we ingest them, our system, our digestive system, breaks it down into the various components and distributes it throughout the body for many purposes. Now, the whole thing, of course, is dependent on the quality of the soil. Unfortunately, over the years, commercial growing has depleted all of the large land masses that they control, but they continue to want to make money from them, so they continue to throw on Band-Aids without really replenishing or correcting the soil. And because of that, grow very sick plants, which in turn are going to be eaten up by the insects because they are sick, and nature always gets rid of those things which are going downhill, meaning they're sick or dying, and the insects come and eat those sick and dying plants. And the reason they're sick and dying is because they're being grown in soil that does not have proper nutrients for them to be healthy. And so then we have to pour huge amounts of pesticides on to keep the insects from eating them up before we get them. And so the game goes on. Now, if that's handled properly, meaning if you can put enough chemicals on to destroy the insects so that they don't eat it all up, and if you can put the basic, most necessary nutrients back in the soil to make the plant grow and look like a plant, then that's highly profitable. And that's where we have been in the commercial growing and food processing industry, which I consider to be two of the most terrible things that have happened to the American health and economy, was the growth and power of the food processing industry, which includes all the way from growing in poor soil and chemicalizing to the production by processing of foods that look like food but have no food value, and the pharmaceutical interests, which thrive by treating the deficiency symptoms that develop in people who are malnourished. Now, I don't know if you're getting that picture or not. And for all of that, we are handed a bill of over almost $3 trillion per year and growing to manage all these people who are sick because of that. Okay, but now we kind of try to sidestep all of that. At least the pharmaceutical and the food growing industry sidestep it by saying, well, the reason we're sick are because of the germs. It's those germs that get us. They come in with those claws and they grab onto us and they devour us and they chew us up. And we have to make more expensive pharmaceuticals to kill them so that we can be healthy. But with all the killing, are we healthier? No. I mean, you'd have to be blind if you didn't really have to say, no, we're not healthier. Forget the projected average life expectancy. In this country, we're not even on the life expectancy list. We're only about 38 in the world. And yet we pump in more drugs. 50% of the world drugs are consumed by this country. And the bill is the highest of any place in the world. There is no control in the pricing, and there is no control hardly at anything to do with food processing and or the pharmaceutical interests. So we get back and we take this food from healthy soil and we put it into our body, and what happens? Well, the body breaks it down into all the different components that are necessary to sustain us and to allow us to grow and have energy to do all the things we want to do and so forth. Those all come from the food. Now, what do we get out of the food? Why do we eat? Well, we get carbohydrates, which actually help us to make energy. We get proteins, which gives us amino acids, which rebuilds the structure and provides the basis for enzymes and hormones and so forth. These are all made from chains of amino acids, complemented by certain vitamins, which also are part of the food, and certain minerals, which act as cofactors from the food. And then we have fats. And of course, fats are fatty acids, and those fatty acids are important in our body. All of these carbohydrates, the proteins, and the fats are also involved in the structure and in building special molecules that carry out certain functions in the body, and of course helping our body to replace itself and to grow and function, and of course to make energy. So basically carbohydrates and fats, carbohydrates main source, fats secondary. in our body to give us the ability to grow, replace worn out tissue, repair injuries, have energy to do all the things we want to do, to energize our immune system so that these germs that come along, our body can take care of them. Now, as I say, the real sickness comes from a sick body because of sick nourishment, which comes from sick soil. Now, I know it's hard to grasp that because we like seeing all the big toys that medicine has produced, these mammoth imaging machines that it only costs $8,000 or $10,000 to get a test on, and bring in huge amounts of money to those institutions that utilize those. But at the same time, when all of that is said and done, and all that money is spent, almost $3 trillion, where is our health? Well, now, and I don't have time, I've mentioned before about this life expectancy thing, which is basically a hoax. It doesn't mean squat, and if you understand probability mathematics and understand how they can be skewed by certain factors, you would understand, those that are mathematicians, that probability equation was skewed from the beginning, and the longer it goes from that beginning, the less skewing there is, and therefore it makes it look like we are expecting to live longer. Not that it says we're living longer, we can expect to live longer. And I said there was research that indicated that the average lifespan, meaning the real lifespan, is more like 85, has been for the last 200 years. There's a whole study on that called the vitality factor, but we don't have time to discuss all that today, only to say that is misleading, but it's brought out every few years to make it look like medicine is making us healthier, when in fact, if your eyes are open at all, you could see that we're not getting healthier, we're getting sicker. But they throw that out. Look what modern medicine has done. The fact is, if they did nothing, that figure would improve every year since 1918 and automatically look like, oh yeah, we can expect to live a little longer. We can expect to, but do we? And are we healthy in so doing? I mean, if you're keeping somebody alive on a ventilator and life support, I'm not sure I would call that living. You might be keeping the body alive, but are they living? Anyhow, we take all this food, and we have to have the right food in the right places in the body to carry out all the functions that need to be done in the body. So here this food comes into your stomach, and if your body's working right, it starts breaking down all these different substances are in the food, separating them, and going to the various areas they need to go in the body from our innate intelligence, and repairing and growing and energizing and defending. All of these things are taking place. Now, as I say, we've kind of been led to believe that the real culprit is the bugs. The bugs. We got to get rid of those bugs. Well, you know, nature in plants, I think I've mentioned it before, but I'll mention it again. Research from the Department of Agriculture. I have some personal acquaintance that has been a researcher in the Department of Agriculture for years. That person said that they had isolated chemicals in a sick plant that attract the insects to eat the plant up. In other words, the plant, when it's sick and ready to die because it's been poisoned or whatever's happened to it, it sends out a message, hey boys, I'm done, come and eat me up, get me out of here. Nature has a recycling of everything. And so it's the same as with plants, even bodies. When they die, we have the carrion, the vultures, the buzzards, the ants, the maggots. I mean, it just goes on and on. Everything gets cleaned up. We have the funguses, especially like with wood. You've seen them on trees. That's part of the cleanup process of nature. So everything gets cleaned up. But if we're going to live, we have to be healthy. And if we're healthy, our body defends itself. And there's very few things that can really disturb us tremendously. Now, sometimes we'll get a little sick, but when we get sick, the symptoms we're getting is our immune system kicking in to defend itself and get rid of something that shouldn't be there. Okay, so now, real fast, we're just going to kind of review the bug issue. Everybody after World War II started hearing about viruses. Now, actually, the word virus is from the Latin, which means poison. It was used in homeopathic medicine way back. Even when they didn't know what it was, Dr. Hahnemann realized there was something that could be poisonous to the body, and he called it a virus, even though he didn't know what it was. And he said it could spread to other people because he was talking about smallpox, measles, things of that nature could spread to other people, but he didn't know what it was. Now, the people who were healthy, like in his time, either it didn't bother them at all, but if it did start to bother them, there were homeopathics that would aid and energize and help the immune system to rapidly dispel it. I've seen that. I've watched it myself. So after almost 40 years of working with it, I know how it works, and I know that it does work. And I've watched people that were supposedly, quote, uncurable or incurable get well. And the faster that the body gets rid of it, many times before it gets very far into the system, then the less of a problem it is for you. And sometimes things are going on, you have no idea that it even happened because your body just automatically is taking care of it. Once it's built antibodies and recognizes it, as soon as it starts to get in your body, it just wipes it out. But a virus is a strange unit and probably misunderstood. I hear people talk about it like it's has a brain and it's doing all these things. What it is a piece of bad information, toxic bad information. Okay, now if you inject into the body any toxic piece of bad information, it could be poisonous to you depending on what it is. Some things are more poisonous than others. You know, arsenic is poisonous. If you get a lot of arsenic in your body, it can kill you. But not as fast and as powerfully as cyanide. Now, both of these are molecules made from atoms, and in and of themselves, the atoms are non-toxic, but when they're put together in certain configurations, they become toxic to the body because they can interfere with certain processes. Cyanide shuts down the production of energy inside the mitochondria of the cells. It shuts everything down. You can't use oxygen, so basically, you're wiped out. And it's pretty fast. Arsenic is slower. You suffer a lot more with arsenic because it starts to destroy things like the lining of your gastric tract. It ulcerates, you have terrible pain and burning, and pretty soon the whole body feels like it's on fire, and you become restless and thirsty, but you can't drink. Trying to drink is not very comfortable. And so it creates a lot of issues. Okay, so both are poisonous, but some less poisonous than others. As far as poisons are concerned. You know, like strychnine is pretty poisonous. Strychnine affects the body very rapidly also. And so does ptomaine. Now, where does ptomaine come from? It comes from rotting protein, which are those amines break apart and form very toxic compounds that can destroy you pretty fast. And that comes from meat. Okay, so as I mentioned before, we get our energy from the soil through the plants that grow, and sometimes secondarily when animals eat the plants and then we eat the animals. And so we're assuming in that chain also that everything is clean and non-toxic and has gotten the proper nutrition. Now, I mentioned before there's a study done in France many years ago. They wrote a book called Soil, Grass, and Cancer, where they realized if the soil is missing certain elements, then actually plants can get cancer. You probably didn't know that, and if you didn't, they can if they're sick. Okay, so you get plants could get cancer, animals could get cancer, and we can get cancer if we all have a problem. And so, at any rate, the virus is a toxic issue. They're very toxic. They don't think in the sense that we think of thinking. They don't devise a plan. They don't try to evade anything. They're just like ingesting a poison. It gets into your circulation, circulates through the body, gets into the cells, and poisons the cells. And so a virus does the same thing. It's a type of poison. The difference is it's made from RNA and or DNA. And so once it gets inside, depending on the nature of it, it can be extremely toxic and can really be destructive ultimately to the cell, because the cell will self-destruct if it gets too poisoned. Or it may just be enough to make you feel yucky when the immune system is dealing with it in some way to get rid of it. I got this book I was going to show. It's called How Pathogenic Viruses Work. But the reason it was interesting to me is that this person says, well, we want to really get into the mind of the virus. Well, the virus doesn't have a mind as we think of it. Outside of the fact that every molecule maybe has a form of consciousness, in the sense that there is some type of an informational field tied in with it, it does not self-direct. In other words, it doesn't say, well, gee, I want to get in that body and I want to get in those cells and I'm going to make that person sick. And if they try to do something to me, they're not going to be able to. Well, the reason they don't respond to antibiotics is because they don't live. They don't take in food, they don't give up byproducts, and they don't have exotoxins, they don't reproduce. Now, it's true that the information that they carry, if picked up by certain cell organelles, like the ribosomes, can use that information to replicate more of it, but that does not require the virus saying, okay, I'm going to get connected with those ribosomes, so they'll make more of the raw material that can assemble itself into more viruses. It's basically more chemical and electromagnetic in nature, and it's not attacking you. Okay, it's just there. I mean, at any given time, we'll have a lot of viruses circulating through our bloodstream, and sometimes even getting into cells. And if it's not so toxic, it may stay there ongoing, or it may get incorporated into the DNA of the cell or the DNA of the mitochondria, and maybe do nothing. Maybe become an intron that does nothing, but it's just there. At any rate, it's different than what people think. And that's why the antibiotics have never done anything. Now they have chemicals that try to interfere with the synthesis of the virus. Unfortunately, those chemicals are extremely toxic in and of themselves because they are another poison. Okay, so enough for viruses. The next big thing that a lot of people get are parasites, and parasites are like little worms or one-celled or multi-celled organisms, and they basically, in most cases, either give off some kind of secretion that's kind of toxic to us, and or they steal our nutrition. So, and sometimes if they're small and they can get into the lymph, they can block up lymph flow and cause tremendous swelling. Sometimes they can get in big clusters in the bowel tract and form a block, and you have to get in sometimes surgically and take them out, because but all of those occur because there was a failure in the digestive system to break them down, because in today's world almost everybody is weak of digestion. So anyhow, that's how they work. You swallow the eggs as a rule, or the larvae of that are so microscopic you can't see it, of some kind of parasite. It hatches in your system and grows into a parasite. They have different types of cycles, and they tend to have an affinity for different areas. But bottom line is, if your digestive system is working extremely well, they get broken down in the gastric tract as a rule, and that's the end of it. There are ways to get them out that don't poison your body in the process if they've once gotten there, but first thing you need to do is to correct the digestion. So we're getting back to the idea that the body is the hero. Actually, there was a book written to that effect many years ago by a doctor by the name of Glasser, who was a world-renowned immunologist, and he said, no matter what you do, ultimately the body has to be the final thing to take care of it. And he says, therefore the body is the real hero. Now, it's not medicine. He said antibiotics to a healthy person might be necessary once in one's life. Now, here's a guy who didn't even believe in natural medicine as I'm talking about, but he said, and he was assuming the body was healthy. You know, medicine assumes that you're healthy if you don't have symptoms, which is not necessarily true. But anyhow, he said that maybe once or twice in your life there might be something happen. Not will be, but could be, that you might require some extreme set of circumstances. Otherwise, she said, they're totally abused in this country. But it's hard to find that book anymore. But it's called The Body's a Hero by Dr. Glasser, if you can find it. And there's other books that have warned about the same issues, but they don't go very far. In fact, one I know that I recommended to other colleagues disappeared, and we called the publisher and they said, well, we decided to pull the book off the market because they were telling you about the dangers of antibiotics and some stuff about AIDS that they didn't want to get out too much. And so they just pulled it off the market, so you couldn't get it. But I fortunately have a couple of copies of that. Otherwise, then there's funguses who grow in a small scale, like Candida grows in your body in a small scale because it cleans up certain types of poisons. And now that I'm saying that, we're going to lead to the bacteria. You're wondering what happened to bacteria. They live in your body in small amounts, but if your body gets really upset and is producing a lot of toxins that they like for food, then they start thriving and growing. So now, of course, we see it there, so we say, well, oh, your problem is Candida. You've got too much Candida. You've got overgrowth of Candida. And so they want to try to kill Candida and by using anti-fungicides, but that's not the real problem. The real problem is that the terrain of the body is messed up, and the real issue to get well is to correct that, because it's always going to be there. Whether you can see it or not, it's there in microscopic amounts in certain areas of the body, especially a lot of the mucosal membrane of the body, and it lives there and even on the skin in small amounts to take care of digesting certain poisons. Now, I said nature has a cycle of keeping everything cleaned up if everything is balanced and working like it should. Okay, so now the fungus won't grow if you basically have the right body, meaning it's healthy and working right, and it's well nourished, which is really hard today. And so, because it's hard, and because it's hard to get good food, then a lot of people are sick, and that's true. But we don't worry about that. We'll just give them some drugs that will cover the symptoms, and then they'll feel better, and then they think they are better, but unfortunately, in the same time, they're going downhill because they're getting sicker, except they don't know they're getting sicker. And then you're going to come back with a more serious problem. It's going to cost more money to treat, but it was the same old problem that was way back there that was taken care of, just covered over because we turned off the signals that it was going on, which is basically what turning off those symptoms means, turning off the immune system. I hope that clicks in your mind. Turn off the symptoms and you're turning off the immune system. Because the symptoms, remember, what is inflammation, which is an immune response? Redness, heat, swelling, and pain. Not very comfortable sometimes, but that's the body doing its job. And if it's a really toxic thing, it's going to be a more profound immune response, and the symptoms are going to be more intense, and you're going to feel more lousy. But it's not permanent, it's only while your body's taking care of the problem. Okay, now, the bacteria. That's a good one, and very complex. It could be a whole broadcast in itself, but I'm just going to briefly mention, number one, you should go back, search through the videos, and watch the one called Homotoxicology. Because bacteria are saprophytes. They live in your body all the time. They carry on certain functions. When you study microbiology in the textbook, it's going to say normal body flora. Okay, that means all the things that live naturally in your body. Now, of course, everybody talks about probiotics in the gastric tract because there's a huge amount of bacteria, like about 7 pounds in a healthy person of good bacteria, live in the bowel tract to help break down toxic materials and to make certain conversions of certain products into other usable products. It's all part of this synergistic function of the whole body system if everything is there and all the nutrients are there. And of course, we don't have the toxic bad attitude. Now that we're not, that's beyond what we're talking about today, but that's one of the toxins that can get in the body. Now there's other toxins that can get in there, and bottom line, toxicity is the real problem. So we can have chemicals, toxic chemicals of all kinds that can get in the body. We can have electromagnetic disturbances, which again is the subject of another whole broadcast. And we can have emotional toxicity or emotional toxins that can be a big problem to the body. But the bacteria really are not the problem. There's a rare exception to that, because there's two major types of bacteria, those that live in humans and those that live in the soil. Okay, getting back to what nature does, nature keeps the soil clean because when something dies of protein nature and gets in the soil, like you bury a dead body in the soil or an animal or whatever, when it dies, there are bacteria that consume that protein and break it back down so that the soil is healthy again. Yeah, I mean, I hope you see the big picture, because that's what we're getting at. Everything in nature is balanced if you leave it alone and don't think you can improve on nature. If you let it do its job and we do our job and we don't mess up the world and we don't mess up the soil, then we can be healthy and we can stay healthy. Everything does its job in balance. Remember, nature took millions of years to work together, and we come along in a few hundred, well, not even 100,000, a few thousand years. We destroy everything because we don't understand nature. We don't want to work with nature because we think we can improve on nature. It's all balanced to work together. So the bacteria that live in the soil, if you get them in your body, they don't attack you, but their digestion produces exotoxins, which means they're poo-poo from the bacteria, because they're one-celled living organisms. In fact, they can even get sick with viruses, which are toxic. Most people don't know that, but a bacterial form is a one-celled living organism. It does take in food, it does give up byproducts, and it does reproduce. It is a living organism. And it doesn't want to be killed. And so it will develop defenses to keep from being killed because it's a living organism. Okay, so the strep lives in your throat, just as an example, and it lives off the poisons that are excreted in the throat area. It has a preference for that area. Staph lives in your nose because it has a preference for a different type of toxin. Okay, Haemophilus lives in your ears, or Streptococcus, that lives in the throat. Pneumococcus and or Klebsiella lives in the lung mucous membrane. E. coli lives in the bowel tract, and it's only when we mess up E. coli and cause it to become genetically altered that it becomes toxic, because it normally lives in the bowel tract. So, they're there to do their job, and as long as we are taking in all the nutrients we need, our immune system is strong, we don't have a problem. And so I asked a researcher, you probably heard me say this before, from a major pharmaceutical, about strep. I said, well, isn't it, all the microbiology books, doesn't it say that strep is a normal flora of the throat? And he said, yes. I said, well, why would it suddenly become pathogenic and attack you? Well, we don't know. But the fact is, it never does become pathogenic. If you produce more poisons in the throat, then more strep grow there to break down those poisons. So what does that mean? It means that you don't have strep throat. You always have strep throat. At any given time, you can take a swab, put it in the throat, put it on a bacterial growth medium, and it will reproduce strep because it lives there all the time. But if there's a lot of poison for it to eat, because it lives off of your poisons, then it will grow more. There'll be more of them. And this study has actually been done in England at the London Homeopathic Hospital. They actually took strep throat people, cultured it. There's a huge amount. They gave them the right homeopathic. They gave them no antibiotics. The problem settled down. They went back, recultured the throat, and it was back down to normal background. I don't know if this is sticking to your net. So they don't attack you. It's only their exotoxins that can be toxic, and those that are normal to our body don't attack us. There could be one exception. If you poured a lot of antibiotics in and you poisoned the strep, remember it's a one-celled living organism, you could cause it to pick up a virus which could alter its genetic and cause it to function differently. And that's exactly what was done with strep that was overtreated with antibiotics, became necrotizing fasciitis, which is the flesh-eating bacteria, because it changed the genetic that forms the enzymes of how it breaks down things to get its nutrients. And so instead of breaking down hyaline tissue by hyaluronidase, which was the enzyme it normally produces, it changed it to produce an enzyme that breaks down fascia. So it still didn't attack you, it's just doing its job. It's living by eating what its genetic gives it the capability of eating. And in this case, not so good for humans because we just created a Frankenstein monster by abusive antibiotics. Okay, so I think I've given you a little bit of idea about it. And we'll go into it more as time goes on, but this bug thing is really bugging me because we have, in 40 years, been able to take care of all kinds of problems without antibiotics. I personally have not had an antibiotic in probably 55 years or more. And I'm still alive. And I would say I'm reasonably healthy. Anyhow, I hope this has provoked you to go back and look at my homotoxicology broadcast so we tie in the bacteria there with what's going on with the body's ability to take care of itself. Now, don't go running off and say I said, don't ever have to worry about anything. I would be concerned, but killing bacteria by putting a bactericide soap on your hand is only going to mutate it to keep it from dying. And once it mutates, it's going to become resistant. We are always talking about antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Well, of course, they're living organisms. They don't want to be poisoned. If you try to poison them, they resist it. And so they mutate the same as human beings don't want to be killed. And our genetic can mutate. It can change and adapt to not to be killed. All living organisms are like that. But whether it's friend or foe, it's our decision. And if it's our normal bacteria in the body, they're great. And as I say, the gut tract in a healthy person has at least 7 pounds of bacteria. And has a bunch of bacteria. I mean, we're talking about probably trillions of bacterioforms. And so, I hope I've enlightened you a little bit. We've come to the end of our broadcast. We've gone over slightly what we should have. It was nice to be with you again. Don't forget to go to our website, peruse through our pages, click our link to Alternative Health and Prevention, and be sitting on the edge of your chair anxiously awaiting our next broadcast. Until then, be healthy.